Davos rarely becomes a place of geopolitical rifts. The World Economic Forum has been built for decades on the idea of interdependence. Trade, investment, international supply chains, technological cooperation. But on January 20, 1926, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, speaking before assembled corporate leaders and high-ranking officials, effectively declared the end of an entire era. Globalization, which once promised mutually beneficial cooperation and shared growth, has given way to intensified economic warfare. What was called integration just yesterday is increasingly being used today as a tool of pressure. Tariffs have become levers of coercion, financial infrastructure a means of punishment, and supply chains weak points that are now targeted deliberately, not by accident. According to Carney, the giants are moving forward, leaving everyone else with no choice but to unite for self-defense. The global financial architecture still remains unequal. According to the IMF, in the fourth quarter of 2025, the US dollar accounted for 56.77% of the world's official currency reserves. The euro accounted for 20.5%, and the Chinese yuan only 1.95%. That means the main weapon of the old system is still concentrated in Washington's hands. But that's exactly why other major powers are now working not only to increase their influence, but also to reduce their own vulnerability to American financial power. The essence of the new moment is not that the world has stopped being interdependent, but that this interdependence is no longer neutral. In this new reality, it's not just medium or small states that are getting nervous anymore. The major centers of power are also increasingly feeling how exposed they are to their opponents' strikes. The United States is tightening export controls on advanced chips, restricting China's access to computing and artificial intelligence technologies. China, in turn, in April 2025, introduced export controls on goods related to 7 types of medium and heavy rare earth elements. In other words, both sides have long since stopped just trading. They are building positions for a prolonged economic struggle, in which access to technology, materials, and payment capabilities becomes no less a resource of power than an army or a navy. That's why 2 weeks after Davos, U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance gathered ministers from over 50 countries in Washington for the first ever meeting of ministers on critical minerals, to try to break China's monopoly on rare earth elements. In the opening remarks, the idea of large-scale government stockpiling of strategic reserves was mentioned. In particular, a $2 billion package for a defense reserve was mentioned. This is not just resource diplomacy, but an attempt to rapidly build alternative supply infrastructure outside the zone of Chinese dominance. At the same time, Beijing is strengthening another line of defense, the currency and financial one. After Carney's speech at the beginning of February 2026, Qixi, the flagship journal of the Communist Party of China, published a speech by Chinese leader Xi Jinping, in which he called for granting the yuan the status of a reserve currency. Meanwhile, Chinese regulators urged banks to limit the purchase of U.S. Treasury bonds. In reality, there is a gap between China's ambitions and reality. According to SWIFT, in January 2026, the yuan rose to 5th place among global payment currencies with a share of 3.13%, and in trade finance, its share reached 8.46%. However, it is still far from being a true reserve or a real alternative to the dollar. The yuan has grown as a settlement instrument, but it has not become an equal substitute in the dollar system. Vance's call to action and Xi's speech are evidence that the world is moving in 2 directions at once. The first is an economic arms race, in which states inventory their own levers of influence and look for ways to strike their opponent. The second is the search for economic security, safe havens, backup routes, friendly jurisdictions, parallel payment schemes, and strategic reserves. In 2024, 3 leading countries, China, Malaysia, and the United States accounted for 97% of the world's rare earth element refining. So what's important is not only the extraction itself, but also the critical concentration of processing. That's exactly where geoeconomic leverage is created. Over the past 2 decades, American officials have been developing economic warfare strategies in a unipolar world. Used to playing offense, Washington paid little attention to the risk of retaliation or unexpected attacks. That world is gone. The new one is defined by mutual vulnerability and a constant search for leverage. The United States and China possess the most powerful arsenals. But, as the war in Iran has shown, smaller states can also inflict devastating consequences on the global economy by exploiting choke points. Tehran's closure of the Strait of Hormuz at the beginning of the conflict led to a rise in energy prices, forcing Washington to change its military objectives. According to the International Energy Agency, in 2025, about 20 million barrels of oil and petroleum products passed through it daily on average. That's about a quarter of the world's seaborne oil, and nearly 20% of global liquefied gas trade. The United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, in April 2026, recorded that the average daily number of ship passages through the strait dropped from 129 in the second half of February to 6 in March, which is a 95% decrease. Against this backdrop, benchmark oil prices have surged sharply. The Dubai indicator jumped to $126 per barrel. European Brent rose to about $113. Russian Urals to $110, and American WTI to $101 per barrel. The closure of the strait sharply increased oil and gasoline prices and created strong political pressure on the White House. Opponents can also adapt the logic of economic warfare to kinetic conflict. Opponents use drones and missiles to shape the behavior of private firms, just as the United States does with financial sanctions. Opponents use drones and missiles to shape the behavior of private firms, just as the United States does with financial sanctions. Waging economic warfare in this divided world is no longer limited to sanctions or tariffs. It encompasses minerals, logistics, chips, currency. Opponents can also adapt the logic of economic warfare to kinetic conflict. The state's opponents are learning not only to strike at the vulnerabilities of their adversary, but also to change the behavior of markets, investors, carriers, banks, and industrial groups. And if Washington wants not just to wage economic war, but to win strategically, it will have to rethink its approach. To use power without undermining its own foundations, to reduce dependencies without self-destruction, to strengthen security without stifling growth, to manage escalation against adversaries without losing allies. Otherwise, the United States will be stuck fighting the last war while a new economic order takes shape, one much less favorable to American interests than the old one. Friends, we have an ambitious goal to reach 200,000 subscribers on the channel by the end of 2026. You might have been watching us for a long time and not even realize that you haven't subscribed. Subscribe to our channel and tell your relatives and friends about it. Also, give us a like and leave a comment under this video. We thank all our donors, patrons, and sponsors on YouTube. Every hryvnia you donate brings Ukraine closer to economic prosperity and well-being. Because we are not just making videos, we are educating voters who will choose real reformers. Help us with this. The link to support the price of the state is in the description. The first task in the world of economic warfare is to map out the bottlenecks. Subscribe for more. Our reports on the Strait of Hormuz were important. And besides that, let me tell you, a critical part of the world's oil consumption passes through it. For Qatari liquefied gas, there is practically no alternative to this passage. Economic bottlenecks have become popular recently. When business favored just-in-time supply chains, a precisely timed system. But when major geopolitical competition emerged, this efficiency turned out to be vulnerable. At the same time, Real bottlenecks have three common characteristics. One country or a coalition of close allies holds a dominant, concentrated share of the market. Substitutes are not available in the short term. In addition, the country or coalition can use its position as a weapon in such a way as to exert asymmetric pressure, inflicting significant pain on the target while suffering minimal self-harm. Therefore, mere leadership does not guarantee anything. Let's consider the choke points that Washington and Beijing use most often. U.S. financial sanctions exploit the central role of the dollar. According to the B's Triennial Survey, 2025, the dollar is used in over 89% of all foreign exchange transactions. American export control over advanced semiconductors relies on a similar dynamic. One company, Silicon Valley's NVIDIA, holds over 85% of the artificial intelligence chip market. China, for its part, is a leading supplier of rare earth elements, with an average share of about 60% of global production, according to estimates by the International Energy Agency for 2024. About 91% in refining, and about 94% in the production of permanent magnets based on them. In each case, the United States or China is not just a market leader, they are actually monopolists. When a country lacks such concentration, its leverage weakens. Take, for example, American tariffs, which put pressure on foreign countries by reducing the competitiveness of their exports in the U.S. market. When Donald Trump announced large-scale tariffs on almost every country in April 2025, he stated that they would submit to his will because America is the largest market in the world. Trump was right about the scale. The United States is the largest importer of goods in the world, but their share of global goods imports is only about 1/8. UNCTAD estimates global goods trade in 2024 at about $25 trillion. Meanwhile, the U.S. profile in the WTO data portal shows imports at about $3.1 trillion. So, roughly speaking, that's about 12 to 13% of the global market, not 80 or 90%. Even if an average country were completely banned from the U.S. market, it could still reorient itself to other markets. In truly narrow zones, the math is reversed. The controlling country usually holds a larger share of the relevant market, leaving target companies access to only a small portion. This partly explains why Trump's tariffs often failed to put pressure on other countries. Although they sharply reduced exports from Brazil and China to the United States, both countries were so successful in increasing sales to other countries that they set annual records. According to MDIC, Brazil's exports reached a historic high of about $348.7 billion in 2025. According to an official statement from the State Council of the People's Republic of China, with data from the General Administration of Customs, China's exports rose to $3.7 trillion, and total foreign trade reached $6.2 trillion. That is, a tariff can hit a specific sales channel, but that does not make it a universal tool of coercion. Even if a country has a dominant share, one more thing is needed: the absence of a short-term substitute. For example, at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic in January 2020, the United States imported about 3/4 of its medical masks from China. Domestic manufacturers supplied less than 10% of the demand. As the virus spread rapidly in China, Beijing restricted exports to ensure supplies for its own population. The result was empty shelves throughout the United States. The shortage was so severe that United States health authorities advised Americans not to wear masks in order to ensure supplies for doctors and nurses. But this market turned out to be replaceable much faster than it seemed. According to the USITC, in the second half of 2020, domestic production increased sharply. Import dependence began to decline, and monthly respirator production in the US increased more than fourfold. to over 95 million per month. The same logic applies to other goods that are relatively simple and require little capital to produce, such as clothing and furniture. Even if one country captured the market for these goods, it would still be difficult to use them as effective economic weapons because substitution takes little time. Capital-intensive products, such as refined rare earth elements, are much harder to substitute. The International Economic Agency estimates that the average global cycle from the discovery of a deposit to the first extraction is more than 16 years. That is, launching new projects is a structurally slow process. Even if the more optimistic forecast by U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent that the United States can overcome China's influence on the rare earth supply chain within 2 years turns out to be accurate. That's a long time to remain vulnerable to Chinese pressure. In the service sector, network effects add to this problem. The more participants use a particular system, the harder it is to replace it. That's why U.S. financial services are such a powerful barrier. The widespread use of the dollar makes it extremely difficult to create a viable alternative. Beyond serving as a full-fledged choke point, the tariffs on Canada illustrate well the limits of American pressure. Canada sends over 75% of its exports to the United States. In oil, the dependence is even stronger. The Canada Energy Regulator shows that in 2023, the United States accounted for 96% of their hydrocarbon exports. And because of geography and the fixed location of oil and gas pipeline infrastructure, it can't do anything to quickly diversify and leave the U.S. market. And acknowledging this fact, Trump stated that the United States has virtually unlimited influence over Canada. So, Ottawa is really strongly tied to the American market. But in reality, Washington can't cause it much pain without significant losses for itself. Economist David Henderson from the Hoover Institution calculated that a tariff on Canadian goods would cost an American household about $700. This would also disrupt automobile production and lead to a sharp increase in gasoline and electricity prices, since U.S. refineries and power grids depend on Canadian supplies. So it's no surprise that after the decisions made in March 2025, Customs and the White House were forced to quickly introduce exceptions for certain goods. By December 2025, the effective overall U.S. tariff rate on Canada was only 3.1%, which is the lowest among Washington's major trading partners. A similar mistake was made in the assessment of the Strait of Hormuz. Before the start of the U.S.-Israeli war in Iran in February 2026, American officials likely misinterpreted Tehran's ability to use it as an asymmetric tariff. The responsibility of the weapon gave them a false sense of security. Analysts assumed that Iran would not dare to close it, since this would require laying dozens of naval mines. And Iran also depends on the waterway for exporting its own oil. But the crisis showed that to cause an economic shock, it's not necessary to completely seal off the strait. It's enough to raise the risk to the point where private carriers, insurers, and traders start avoiding it themselves. By striking a small number of ships with relatively cheap drones and missiles, Iran changed the risk calculations of the global shipping industry. Tankers carrying Iranian oil could freely pass through the strait, while those carrying oil from other Persian Gulf countries either faced resistance or were challenged. Chinese rare earths provide a clearer example. In 2024, China earned about $3.4 billion from the export of rare earth elements and magnets. Meanwhile, according to macroeconomic models, disruptions in the supply of critical minerals can lead to significant GDP losses. In one scenario, a 30% disruption in the supply of just one rare earth element to the United States would reduce the country's GDP by 0.2%, which is more than $600 billion. In other words, China would have to forego no more than a few $1 billion in export revenues to inflict losses of over $500 billion on the U.S. economy. This asymmetry gives Chinese export controls their power. It also highlights the broader reality of economic warfare. States do not weaponize interdependence. They weaponize dependence. The first rule of economic warfare: don't weaponize fake choke points. But even if Washington manages to follow this rule, it still gets caught in a dangerous feedback loop. Every time the US starts targeting another country's dependence on the dollar, technology, or financial infrastructure, other states accelerate their hedging, diversification, and self-sufficiency policies. But over time, the cumulative effect can undermine trust in the US dollar or suppress demand for American goods. This is especially important when you consider the scale of what's at stake. The dollar accounted for 58% of the world's officially disclosed foreign currency reserves in the second quarter of 2025. The dollar's share has declined from its peak of 72% of reserves in 2001. About 50% of international payments in SWIFT and 88% of global currency transactions in one way or another go through the dollar. In the first quarter of 2025, foreign investors held about $9 trillion, or 32% of all marketable U.S. Treasury securities outstanding. More than $1 trillion in U.S. dollar cash was circulating outside the United States. That is, American power is still enormous, but that's exactly why its misuse can be very costly. When other countries learn to live without American finance, chips, or energy resources, it's not just about geopolitics, but also about the future demand for American products themselves. So, the United States needs not just an arsenal of sanctions, export controls, and tariffs, but a plan for how to use its influence without burning it out in the process. The optimal architecture of sanctions, export controls, and other economic pressure measures entirely depends on the purpose for which they are applied. In a broad sense, such a policy serves three different goals. The least ambitious is stigmatization, what American officials call naming and shaming, exposing and shaming. The second is to limit and exhaust the opponent by depriving them of access to technology, capital, or markets, such as U.S. export controls on microchips intended for China. As former U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan put it, their goal was to maintain as much of an advantage as possible for the United States in the race to develop advanced semiconductors and artificial intelligence. During the Biden and Trump administrations, export control was a strategy of attrition aimed not at changing Beijing's behavior, but at containing China's technological capabilities. The third goal is coercion, using economic pressure to force another state to change its course or the policies of another government. Data on targeted UN sanctions show that they work noticeably better as a tool for signaling and constraint than as a tool for direct coercion. The effectiveness of coercion was assessed at about 10 cases, while the figure for constraint was around 20%, and as a signal, about 27%. Symbolic sanctions themselves are not bad, but they are not harmless either. They can hinder banks from operating in developing countries, reducing America's influence and causing humanitarian harm. When it comes to coercion, the difference between deterrence and forcing a policy rollback is fundamental. The Biden administration's warnings in 2022 about swift and serious consequences if Russia invaded Ukraine were a classic example of deterrence logic, whereas the Trump administration's maximum pressure strategy on Iran has now been officially reinstated. An SPM 2 memorandum from February 4, 2025 aimed to force Tehran to restrain its nuclear program and support for proxies. As of April 2026, the Office of Foreign Assets Control reports that after the launch of this campaign, more than 1,000 individuals, vessels, and aircraft have already been sanctioned. This is economic warfare in its most ambitious form, not to assign blame, but to change behavior. American politicians rarely articulate clear objectives when waging economic warfare, but distinguishing objectives at the outset of any economic pressure campaign should be a priority, because they can steer the strategy in opposite directions. Consider a potential invasion of Taiwan by China. If Washington intends to use economic warfare as a deterrent that materializes only in that case, if Beijing crosses the line, then the optimal strategy would be to accumulate leverage by increasing China's dependence on American technologies and keeping them in reserve. Thus, when Xi is considering whether to act, the United States can threaten a serious economic blow to deter him. On the other hand, if the goal is not to deter, but to weaken China's capabilities right now, and thus reduce the likelihood of a successful invasion, the best course of action is to use leverage now by cutting off China's access to American technologies before the war begins. Because after the fighting begins, economic attrition does little if the conflict does not drag on. In 2021, Taiwan provided about 21% of the world's semiconductor manufacturing capacity, including 92% of the capacity for the most advanced chips. In the first quarter of 2023, Taiwanese foundry companies together accounted for nearly 70% of the global revenue in this segment. When such a large portion of global production is concentrated in one city, the difference between deterring and depleting determines not only the intent of sanctions, but also the strategy for how events may unfold. That's why there are disputes within Washington. The execution is random. Jake Sullivan, the U.S. President's national security advisor, formulated a clear goal in 2022. In critical technologies, it is necessary to maintain as large a lead as possible. The largest possible gap. This logic was the basis for the shift on October 7, 2022. At that time, the United States changed the rules to restrict China's access to advanced computer microchips and equipment for semiconductor manufacturing. On October 17, 2023, these restrictions were further tightened. But in May 2025, the Trump administration repealed Biden's AI diffusion rule, while simultaneously announcing new steps to strengthen controls on chip exports. And on January 2026, the White House added a 25% tariff on certain computing chips to this mix. In other words, American policy has not abandoned the idea of technologically exhausting China. At the same time, it began experimenting with a regime in which it is convenient not to completely destroy part of the enemy's dependence, but to meter it out. The Trump administration's hesitations regarding export controls embody the danger of waging economic war without a clearly defined goal. One camp in the administration, consisting of more traditionally hawkish officials such as Secretary of State Marco Rubio, insists on tightening restrictions to hinder China's progress in the field of artificial intelligence. The other camp advocates for loosening restrictions to strengthen China with American chips. As Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick put it, China, they say, should not get the best, not the second, not even the third-tier American chips, but should continue using fourth-tier chips, so that Chinese developers remain dependent on the American technology stack. There is a cold rationality in this, and both viewpoints have their own logic, but only for different objectives. Whatever the objective may be, economic pressure rarely benefits from overly cautious, creeping escalation. American politicians often tighten the screws step by step. However, as soon as new sanctions or export controls are introduced, the targeted country begins to adapt, develop workarounds, cultivate alternative suppliers, and invest in self-sufficiency. China is already showing that even under intense pressure, adaptation can be swift. In 2024, its production of integrated circuits reached 405.4 billion units. which is more than 22% higher than in 2023. Exports amounted to 298.1 billion units, imports were over 549 billion units. This does not mean that export control is not working. It means that any control triggers an adaptation program. If the United States really wants to wage economic war seriously, external pressure alone is not enough. A parallel buildup of its own manufacturing base is needed. That is why the CHIPS Act of 2022 provided nearly $53 billion in government support for the development of semiconductors in the United States. Out of this amount, $39 billion are allocated for launching and expanding production of manufacturing, and more than $13 billion for research, workforce training, and other related programs. As of July 2025, the Department of Commerce has already allocated funding among 19 companies for 40 projects, almost $31 billion in direct subsidies and another $5.5 billion in the form of loans. According to estimates by the U.S. Government Accountability Office, these investments are expected to increase the United States' share in advanced chip production from 0% in 2022 to 20% in 2030. If you tighten restrictions step by step without simultaneously building your own factories, materials, equipment, and supply chains, the result will be predictable, and your opponent will become less dependent on you faster than you become less dependent on them. It is just as important to maintain the leverage itself as it is to apply the right amount of economic pressure at the right moment. The more Washington uses a choke point as a weapon, the stronger the incentive for other countries to reduce their dependence on the United States. In 2016, then U.S. Treasury Secretary Jack Lew warned about this. The power of sanctions is inextricably linked to America's leading role in the global economy, and their excessive use could undermine both that role and the effectiveness of the sanctions themselves. This incentive often goes far beyond the immediate target. After Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, Washington imposed sanctions on Moscow that restricted Russian companies and banks from accessing parts of the American financial system. For Beijing, this became an obvious lesson. If Washington can act this way with Moscow, one day it could do the same with China. This episode prompted China's leaders to create their own payment systems to reduce the impact of U.S. financial sanctions on the country. In 2015, China launched the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, or CIPS, designed to clear yuan transactions without relying on Western intermediaries. Later, Beijing took this approach further by launching a central bank digital currency. The digital yuan and the M-Bridge digital payment platform allow central banks to settle transactions directly with each other. According to the People's Bank of China, by the end of September 2025, the total volume of transactions in the digital yuan reached 14.2 trillion yuan, or approximately $2 trillion. And the number of personal wallets in the eCNY app reached 2,925,000,000. These initiatives do not yet pose a serious challenge to the dominance of the dollar, but directly creating a global competitor to the settlement system is not necessarily Beijing's main goal. China seeks to build a parallel infrastructure that could quickly expand during a crisis. It's more like an insurance policy, not a complete replacement. CIPS is developing rapidly, and as of March 26, it has about 1,700 participating institutions in 126 countries and regions. The annual transaction volume for 2025 is estimated by the system itself at 180 trillion yuan, or $26.5 billion. This is still much less than the scale of SWIFT, which connects over 11,500 institutions in more than 220 countries and territories. But it's already enough in case China is cut off from the dollar. It could support settlements in yuan on a significant scale. The digital yuan and M-Bridge are moving in the same direction. They don't destroy the dollar's dominance, but they create technological and procedural frameworks for a world where the dollar infrastructure is no longer the only possible route. And despite the threat these efforts pose to American influence, Washington has treated the future of payments more as a technical issue than as an element of geopolitical power. In fact, the U.S. should have taken more serious steps to modernize Western payment systems, making them faster, cheaper, and more attractive, rather than just trying to slow down Chinese alternatives. A more systemic challenge may come from a less obvious source. The internationalization of the yuan is held back by Chinese capital controls and the uncertainty of doing business in a country where the rule of law is lacking. The euro, on the other hand, is a convertible and liquid currency backed by stable democratic governments. In the field of payments, where simplicity and reliability matter most, it has clear advantages. The euro is already the second international currency. Central banks hold about 20% of their reserves in euros, second only to the dollar with about 57%. At the same time, the dollar was involved in about 88% of global over-the-counter currency transactions, while the euro accounted for 31%. These are IMF data for 2022. Speaking in favor of a digital version of the euro, Christine Lagarde, the president of the European Central Bank, emphasized that this project is a political statement about Europe's sovereignty. The same logic lies behind the long-delayed attempts to stitch together the fragmented EU capital market. In 2025, the European Commission launched the Savings and Investment Union, explaining that about 70% of EU household savings, which is roughly 10 trillion euros, are still sitting in bank deposits, instead of working through a deeper single capital market. As these initiatives progress, the euro may be able to attract users far beyond Europe, especially those who fear that the United States could weaponize the dollar against them. The bottom line for U.S. policymakers is that whenever possible, they should coordinate with the EU and other allies. This is important because coordination prevents the dollar from appearing as the sole reserve currency with a special geopolitical risk premium. After the reserves of the Central Bank of Russia were frozen in response to the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, there was no immediate flight from the dollar. The EU estimated the total amount of immobilized assets of the Russian Central Bank in the jurisdictions of the G7 EU, and Australia at about 260 billion euros, more than two-thirds of which were in the EU. The dollar's share in international payments did not collapse. On the contrary, in 2025, the Federal Reserve noted that the dollar maintained about 50% of international payments in SWIFT and about 58% of official reserves. Other G7 currencies, including the euro, the pound, and the yen, were also part of the sanctions coalition, and therefore did not appear to be a neutral haven from political risk. A bigger problem for the United States is that a significant part of the world has come to believe that after 2 decades of intensifying bipartisan economic warfare, Washington could eventually weaponize everything against everyone. Reducing risks from the U.S. is increasingly seen as prudent caution rather than as an anti-American gesture, even among governments that have not yet been direct targets. Take cloud services, where American tech giants Amazon, Microsoft, and Google together hold more than 70% of the global market share. This is data for 2024. Fears that Washington could use this dominance as a weapon have prompted European governments to fund domestic technology stacks, layers of hardware and software that underpin digital services, to replace American software in government institutions and create sovereign clouds protected from U.S. reach. In 2025, the European Commission launched and later awarded a tender worth 180 million euros to procure sovereign cloud services for EU institutions for a period of 6 years. The winners were European providers and consortia. Denmark has already started moving the Ministry of Digitalization from Windows and Microsoft 365 to Linux, LibreOffice, and other open-source solutions, directly linking this to digital sovereignty. In other words, even the assumption that American technological dependence could one day become a political lever is already prompting allies to develop backup solutions. The only viable solution is to establish legislative barriers. There are already limited sanction-free zones in current U.S. law. And there is the PA. The main law on the president's emergency economic powers limits sanctions on food, medicine, and informational materials. But the president retains extremely broad powers to impose sanctions for almost any reason. Just in the past year, Trump imposed sanctions on Brazilian Federal Supreme Court Judge Alexandre de Moraes and his wife for prosecuting former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro and accusing him of politically motivated prosecutions and human rights violations. Against Colombian President Gustavo Petro, his wife, and his son for their alleged involvement in international drug trafficking. The administration imposed sanctions against the International Criminal Court and added prosecutor Karim Khan to the SDN list, as well as sanctioned 4 more judges. In March 2026, Trump also publicly threatened to cut off all trade with Spain after its government denied American troops access to its bases during the war with Iran. To prevent the abuse of sanctions, lawmakers would need to create broader sanction-free zones, meaning they would have to designate additional sectors that cannot be weaponized without congressional approval. A similar approach should also be applied to sanctions against the United States' treaty allies. If the president wants to punish a country with which America has formal security commitments, this should not be the decision of a single office or a single political impulse. Such institutional checks still allow Washington to use leverage when necessary, but they will prevent capricious actions that undermine the foundations of American economic power. The more easily and frequently a country uses economic weapons, the more it encourages others to look for alternative routes. And a state that pushes its own levers too recklessly risks waking up in a world where those levers still exist, but no longer provide the same leverage. That is why, for the United States, the economy has never been an end in itself. It has been a tool in a broader geopolitical game. From the moment the Monroe Doctrine defined the Western Hemisphere as Washington's sphere of influence, the United States has thought in terms of space, security, and balance. Later, through the Marshall Plan, America invested over $13 billion to create a politically loyal and economically integrated Europe. This was not charity, but geopolitical investment with a long-term effect. The same logic was at the core of the creation of the Bretton Woods system. The dollar became the global reserve currency not to fill the treasury and immediately bring fiscal revenues, but because it secured the structural advantage of the United States in the world economy. Control over the financial architecture meant more than tax revenues. It meant the ability to shape the rules of the game. Even in more pragmatic budgetary instruments, this hierarchy of priorities did not disappear. The Donald Trump administration actively promoted tariff policies, claiming that tariffs brought billions of dollars into the U.S. budget. By February 26th, more than $160 billion in cumulative tariff revenues. This is without refunds to importers, according to the U.S. Supreme Court's decision on tariffs. But the actual goal of these tariffs was not so much the fiscal effect as changing the behavior of trading partners, especially China, and the redistribution of global value chains. So even when the argument sounded like it was about money, the action was about power. This is the key American constant. Geopolitics comes before fiscal arithmetic, and they have repeatedly sacrificed short-term economic gains for the sake of strategic positions. From supporting allies to sanctions regimes that sometimes harmed their own companies. Because in the long run, control over the system matters more than medium-term profits. But when economic tools start being used too directly as a source of income, they lose their main function of being a sphere of influence. A world that feels pressure begins to reorganize itself. And then it no longer responds as easily even to the most powerful economic levers. What do you think? Are tariffs and the overuse of economic leverage a sign of strength or fear? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'll continue in part 2 to explore achieving economic order today. Thanks to Atlas Network for supporting this video. The author's opinions don't necessarily reflect those of Atlas Network. This video was created thanks to the support of Atlas Network. The opinions of the authors of the video do not necessarily reflect those of Atlas Network.